un químico californiano, es profesor emérito por la Universidad de Harvard y es una de las personas que más ha impulsado el estudio de la dinámica de los procesos químicos a partir de haces moleculares, que es digamos, la razón por la que recibió el Premio Nobel de Química en 1986. A nosotros nos llena de alegría desde el DIPC que sea el primer ponente de hoy por varias razones. Yo creo que hay dos razones por las que Dudley Herschback simboliza muy bien el espíritu de Passion for Knowledge, de pasión por el conocimiento. Por una parte, su entusiasmo. Su mirada es una mirada entusiasta que ilusiona. Él se ilusiona hablando de ciencia y él ilusiona a los demás hablando de ciencia. Y es algo que creo que apreciamos mucho nosotros. Y por otra parte, siempre ha sido un gran embajador de Passion for Knowledge, aconsejándonos en muchas ocasiones en lo que es el diseño del programa, en lo que es la promoción de este gran festival. Por eso es un placer y un honor recibir a Dudley Herschback como primer ponente de la tarde de hoy y con un título además muy atractivo para su charla. The Impossible Takes a Little Longer. Dudley, please.
Set this. Good, thank you. Thank you. This is the PowerPoint pause, which is traditional. Okay. There it is. Good. My wife, Georgine, and I are grateful for the opportunity to visit Donista and San Sebastian, same place, again, the seventh time. That's the seventh heaven. We are especially delighted to congratulate the city for its well-deserved designation as Euripean Capital of Culture for 2016. Also to congratulate the Donista International Physics Center, launched only 15 years ago, but already a shining beacon in the world. It is extraordinary, especially for its outreach programs for students and the general public, as well as the fine science it has produced and attracting many scientists as visitors to collaborate. Now, from my experience giving talks, I have found it impossible for me not to take too much time unless I stick strictly to a script, which I will do tonight. It's very unusual, but I will do it. Now, you see, I have on the slide this traditional saying. My father was that was a very favorite one for him, but it also seems appropriate for the passion for knowledge here and generally the whole city and its culture that is so remarkable. The saying is, difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little longer. As a kid, I found that very appealing, that line, impossible, because it has a heroic ring. That appeal has endured. Again and again, I have seen intrepid pioneers achieve wonderful things that had been regarded as impossible. In this talk, I want to suggest how it is that in science, such things are often achieved, and also to emphasize some implications for science education. First, however, I tell a story of an impossible educational triumph. It conveys key aspects of the scientific enterprise, including the practical value of curiosity-driven research and the kinship of science and humanistic culture. The story involves Alexander Graham Bell, Helen Keller, and her teacher, Annie Sullivan. Bell patented the telephone in 1876 at the age of 29. Thereafter, he devoted many years to pursuit of other inventions, but he regarded his life's work as the education of the deaf. His mother and wife were deaf. His father and grandfather were teachers of speech. His family had immigrated from Scotland after both his older brothers had died of tuberculosis. Bell in 1872 began teaching the deaf in Boston, where he founded his own school. 2 years later, he undertook to develop an apparatus that might help some of his not entirely deaf students to distinguish between the sounds of letters P and B. P as in Pedro. Bell, where is Jocelyn Bell? She will speak a little later, for Bell. So P and B can be mixed up if you don't hear well. But that project to help those students led to his invention of the telephone. The technology needed to produce the telephone all existed by 1872, and several expert electricians, as they were called then, were trying to invent it. Bell was not expert. In fact, he knew nothing about electricity when he started work on what became the telephone. Yet after 18 months of intense effort, he became the successful inventor. Why? In later years, Bell liked to say that he would not have conceived the principle of the telephone if he had known more about electricity, but less about the mechanics of music and human speech. In fact, he was a good pianist, and it was while playing the piano at the home of his future wife that he had the key idea that made the telephone succeed. The piano soundboard works much like the diaphragm in the telephone. Helen Keller was deaf and blind since an illness at 19 months. At the age of 6, her parents brought her to Bell to ask his opinion whether she could be educated. Bell thought so, and he made arrangements that led to Annie Sullivan becoming Helen's teacher. Annie was then 20 years old, still suffering from the effects of trachoma, which had made her temporarily blind for a few months. Annie had no teaching experience and not much to guide her except her good sense and acute sensitivity. When Annie joined Helen at her home in Tuscumbia, Alabama, Helen was a wild creature. She was terribly frustrated and constantly raging at having lost the ability to see and to hear. Annie, who could communicate with her only by touch, succeeded in taming her fury. Just a month after Annie's arrival came the great moment that Helen discovered things had names. When Annie held Helen's hand in a stream of water, while touching signals into her hand. Thereafter, Helen learned words rapidly. Within 3 months, Helen was writing brief letters. Within 3 years, she had an astounding command of idiomatic English. Helen's success was hailed as a miracle. Mark Twain and others who visited her specifically to find out came away saying it was miraculous. But Bell had a different view, especially in the early years and for decades after. He helped and supported Helen and Annie in many ways and knew just how they worked together. Bell insisted that Helen's mastery of idiomatic English was, I quote him now, not a case of supernatural acquirement, but a question of instruction, a brilliant experiment by Annie. What was Annie's teaching method? Bell concluded that the key was Annie's, again I'm quoting him, quote, constant spelling of natural idiomatic English into Helen's hand without stopping to explain unfamiliar words and grammar, and her encouragement of Helen's reading book after book in Braille with a similar reliance on context to explain new language. Bell stressed that this was equivalent to the way a hearing and sighted child learns. Annie, in her own description of her teaching, confirms that she purposely never explained anything unless Helen asked a question. Thereby, Annie helped Helen to discover and actively exercise her ability to discern clues and context and to learn on her own. Now, this next slide is a photo taken in 1894 in the garden of Bell's home in Washington, D.C. Helen was then 16, Annie 30, Bell 48. As you see, Helen was reaching up to read Annie's lips while communicating with Bell with their fingers, exchanging messages. 6 years later, Helen entered Radcliffe College after, with help of Annie, passing several entrance examinations, including Latin, Greek, geometry and algebra, basic science, literature, history, even more. Radcliffe was then an auxiliary of Harvard. The same professors taught women students, which only happened in the previous 20 years, but had to do so more than a kilometer away from the Harvard classrooms. Otherwise, they would have upset the young men. In her second year, as part of a creative writing course, Helen wrote an autobiography, which became a bestseller. Later, she published many articles and several books. She even developed the ability to speak and gave many public lectures. Well, how does the inspiring story of Helen and Annie pertain to science? Well, the teaching style of Annie Sullivan is intrinsic to frontier science, frontier research in science. Nature is a reticent teacher. She speaks to us abundantly, but in many alien tongues, alien. She does not offer explanations. It's up to us to ask probing questions and generate our own understanding. In frontier research, we try to discover or add to knowledge of the vocabulary and grammar of some strange dialect of nature. To the extent we succeed, we gain the ability to decipher many messages that nature has left for us. No matter how much human effort and money we might devote to solve a practical problem in science or technology, failure is inevitable unless we can read the answers that nature is willing to give us. That's why basic curiosity-driven research is an essential and practical investment and why its most important yield is ideas and understanding. We are all we are all born blind and deaf to much of nature's language, and it takes persistent groping and guessing to learn something of it. Well, there are implications for science education. In introductory courses, I urge students to approach the study of science like that of a foreign language. It's often said that in the study of languages, once you get it in your ear, it gets easier and easier. Otherwise, harder and harder. That goes for science too. Actual counts have shown that in introductory science textbooks for high school or college, the number of new words or ordinary words used with special meanings exceeds the vocabulary of a typical one-year language course. Likewise, the array of interlocking concepts met in a science course functions much like grammatical rules. Now, the impossible empowerment of Helen by language exemplifies the highest aim of education, to instill in the student the habit of self-generating questioning and thinking, of actively scrutinizing evidence and puzzling out answers. We should do all we can to help students strive to attain understanding rather than ritualistic training, cultural perspective, and self-reliant thinking rather than conventional knowing. Such an approach is equally applicable to science and the humanities. For both novice scientists and students destined for other careers, teachers should emphasize the human adventure of intellectual exploration and help students take ownership of the subject. Now, what makes impossible possible so often in science? Science enjoys, really, a tremendous advantage over many human activities. The goal, call it truth or understanding, waits patiently to be discovered. Thus, marvelous advances can be achieved by ordinary human talent, given sudden, sustained effort and freedom in the pursuit. Far more formidable are enterprises such as business or politics, sports, sadly war. There, the objectives may shift rapidly, so a brilliant move, projected move, often becomes a fiasco rather than a triumph because a little too early or too late and things have changed. That doesn't happen for the science truths. To become a scientist, however, as I like to point out to students, it's somewhat like becoming a musician. Even if you have talent, you must work hard to master your instrument and the literature and the culture that you will serve. But the scientist can, and surely will, play many, even most, of the notes wrong. When he or she gets one right, they will often be appropriately applauded for being so. Even get a Nobel Prize sometime. Now, the uncertain path to impossible. The patience of scientific truth has another important consequence. Often what might appear as the most promising approach does not pan out. There are unanticipated roadblocks. Then it's vital to have some maverick willing to explore unorthodox paths, perhaps straying far from the anticipated or consensus route. In science, it's not even desirable. In fact, much less necessary to be right at each step. At the frontier, scientists are often heading often in wrong directions much of the time, optimistically looking for new perspectives. I like very much a quote of Richard Feynman's. Science is not about what we know. Here we're talking about passion for knowledge. It's about what we don't know. Now, there are ironic consequences for the way we teach science. Science as met in typical high school or college introductory courses is sadly at odds with the adventurous, exploratory character of research. Such courses too often come across as a frozen body of dogma. The questions and problems seem to have only one right answer to be found by some correct procedure. The student who does not easily grasp the right way or finds it uncongenial is likely to become alienated. There seems to be little scope for a personal, innovative experience. That's far from what actual frontier science is like. At the onset, nobody knows the right answer, often not even the right question or right approach. So the focus is on asking an interesting question or casting the familiar in a new light. Isn't that a familiar thing? In artistic creations, the focus is not about getting a right answer, but offering a fresh view of something that stirs thoughts or emotions in the observer. Likewise, scientific work seeks to open up perspectives that stir other people to further explorations. Like art, science is a social enterprise. Its progress depends on the response excited in observers. A good way to combat inhibitions induced in students by too much focus on right answers, have them write poems with science themes to enjoy personal freedom and make some topic their own. So even in my freshman chemistry course, I have the students write poems. Here's an example. I hope, no, I have to point in this direction, I'm told. All right, click. This computer isn't writing the poem. I'll try it. All right, let's give this gadget away. This is a poem by a freshman student, which she was a freshman. She's now a distinguished physician in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But here's a lovely poem. Do you know a special secret place, filling much of invisible space, where frogs can only jump so far, and the range of an ordinary car can be only 10 or 20 miles, and every person has only half or whole smiles, where dogs bark at specific levels of pitch, and people can only be a certain amount rich. Well, of course, people like to get awards for poetry contests, so here's one I give out. This is a little booklet, has 50 woodcuts made by a scientist, Robert Williams Wood, as his hobby. How to tell the birds from the flowers, another woodcut. This is really a lesson in not only science, but, for example, politics, governance, because it's so important to recognize things that might not be so obvious, but are similar or different in important ways. Here's an example from Wood. The parrot and the carrot may easily confound. They're very much alike and similar in sound. We recognize the parrot by his clear articulation, for carrots are unable to engage in conversation. Now, I would like to suggest to this audience in this cultured place that you try writing some poem like this, in this format of wood, where you want to compare two things in this way and draw them so they bring out the similarities. And they also need to have names that fit and so on. So I suggest you get to work and see what you can do. However, I enjoy talking to the students about real poets' work that often does apply to science. Here's one by a Czech poet. Poets don't invent poems. The poem is somewhere behind. It's been there a long, long time. The poet merely discovers it. Well, that's, of course, like our patience of science truth. One last thing I want to stress on this is the importance of guessing. It's intrinsic to science. It's naturally done a lot in learning language, as we already referred to. It's a powerful aid, as seen in the case of Helen Keller. But the usual way of teaching science makes students reluctant to guess. It should be fun. It can be fostered by class discussions, even in large classes, by which groups of 3 or 4 students consult with each other to formulate and defend a guess. Eric Mazur, a colleague at Harvard, has become a great advocate for such teaching. For years, he has taught physics largely in that guessing mode, termed peer learning. He has demonstrated it much effective. It is more effective than ordinary traditional teaching. I like to tell my students, not so many years from now, most of you will be considered expert in something. Then you will find that clients often come to you to ask your opinion, not because of what you know, you might find that on the web, but because they think as an expert you can guess better than they can. And now finish with a Nobel benediction. Usually the front face of the Nobel Prize is shown. Appropriately, it has a profile of Alfred Nobel. But the reverse face of the medal deserves attention as it intends to convey the significance of the awards. For the physics and chemistry medals, here's one. The reverse side depicts 2 elegant women perched among billowing clouds. The erect figure, Natura, as you see, holds in her right hand a cornucopia representing the fruits of knowledge. The kneeling figure holds in her left hand a rather slender scroll representing knowledge we have so far attained. But she reaches up with her right hand to lift the veil of Natura, which she holds intently. The unveiling motif, familiar in antiquity, aptly presents the aim of scientific research. It pertains just as well to science education. For me, this reaches beyond metaphor. These earnest and lovely figures readily morph into another immortal pair, teacher and student, Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller. Thank you.